and seeks to achieve it by reflecting on divine justice. Unfortunately, there is some unclarity in Leibniz's discussion. For in at least one passage, Leibniz seems to view joy as one of the techniques employed by the virtuous person, rather than as the goal to be achieved. If the goal of those of us who would be truly virtuous is to achieve joy founded on the perfection and beauty of things, it's vacuous to say that we should seek to achieve it by feeling a dominant joy founded in reason, as Leibniz does in the passage. To say this would be about as sensible as a doctor telling a patient to achieve the goal of getting better by employing the technique of getting better. By contrast, in the passage quoted by Leibniz, Descartes is clearer about the distinction between goal and method. Quote, even amongst the saddest accidents and the most intense pains, one can always be content, provided one knows how to use reason, unquote. For Descartes here, the goal is clearly contentment, and the technique is reason in some unspecified way. But even if there is some confusion in Leibniz's discussion, it seems clear that whatever techniques the virtuous person employs will not be morally neutral. Before we conclude this section, we should note that on at least one occasion, Leibniz suggests a different strategy of Theodicy that's quite uncharacteristic of him. He says that suffering brings us close to our master, i.e. Christ. Besides, one has no cause to complain of the fact that one ordinarily arrives at salvation only through many sufferings, and by carrying the cross of Christ, these evils serve to render the elect imitators of their master and to augment their happiness, unquote. In this passage, it seems that Leibniz is guilty of a certain sleight of hand. It appears that the standard Neoplatonist thesis that the human mind is an image of God has undergone a remarkable transformation. The Neoplatonist thesis appears to have given way to a doctrine that is more reminiscent of Thomas à Kempis. Following St. Paul, by suffering we come to imitate Christ on the cross. But it seems that Leibniz is not really entitled to say, at least without more explanation, that these evils in themselves serve to increase our happiness. It's true, of course, that Leibniz can say that the more we participate in the divine perfections, the happier we become. But on the face of it, Leibniz is not making that point here. For the sufferings of Christ on the cross are not divine perfections at all. Christ suffers qua human being, not qua second person of the Trinity, and his suffering is an evil or privation of good. In any case, whether we think that Leibniz is guilty of pulling a fast one here, he seems to be departing radically from his standard teaching concerning the imitation of the divine perfections. But perhaps Leibniz can be acquitted of the charge of sleight of hand, or of disingenuously invoking the image of God doctrine. Leibniz's point may well be not that we avoid being wretched and achieve happiness by imitating Christ's sufferings on the cross, but rather that these sufferings or evils provide us with an opportunity to reach a higher level of perfection. They give us an occasion to demonstrate our skills, as it were. Analogously, an innings in which the batter successfully confronts a series of curved balls is of greater value and perfection than one in which the pitcher serves up only lame balls that can be easily dispatched. If this is what Leibniz means, then the claim is consistent with his general principles, but it is elliptically expressed, for it is not strictly the evils themselves that augment our happiness, but rather the power and presence of mind with which we respond to them. Last paragraph. In this paper, I've argued that Leibniz has room for a theodicy in the narrow sense, whereas Malebranche does not. In the service of this project, Leibniz is able to deploy some anti-Cartesian distinctions to good effect. But this contrast at the level of theodicy is symptomatic of a more fundamental difference between the two philosophers. As I suggested near the beginning, it is Leibniz's commitment to the legacy of the Timaeus which helps explain why he holds that God creates the best of all possible worlds in an absolute sense, not the merely relative sense acknowledged by Malebranche. The same Platonic, or better Neoplatonic, inheritance emerges in Leibniz's insistence that human minds are images or mirrors of the divine perfection, and that for this reason God has a special care for their happiness and welfare. Although I cannot claim to have established the thesis here, I believe that this Neoplatonic strand in Leibniz's thought is a source of serious tensions in the theodicy. Leibniz pays lip service to some of the harsher doctrines of Christianity, and he shows his characteristic intellectual agility in defending them against Bale's objections. But he cannot disguise the fact that these doctrines are in conflict with his deepest philosophical commitments. Don Rutherford has observed that, unlike Malebranche, Leibniz arguably succumbs to the inclination to allow reason to overwhelm the revelation of Christianity. I would go further and say that Leibniz is scarcely a Christian thinker at all. He is indeed a theistic philosopher, but a theistic philosopher in the Neoplatonic tradition. Thanks.